This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Money has a strange way of revealing who people really are, the old bartender liked to say. But on that quiet Tuesday afternoon inside Whitford Grill, no one expected a forgotten stack of cash to reveal anything at all, especially not to a tired waitress halfway through a double shift. The lunch crowd had thinned to a gentle hum of clinking glasses and low conversation, the kind of calm that settles over a Manhattan restaurant between the rushes. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows and reflected softly off polished silverware, while Emily Parker moved between tables with the quiet efficiency of someone who had memorized every corner of the dining room. She was 26 years old, 5'6", and currently balancing 3 plates on one arm, while mentally calculating how many hours remained before the end of her shift. 8, if she was lucky. 9, if someone called out sick again. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and her black server's apron carried the familiar weight of order pads, pens, and the small paperback book she read during her breaks. Emily liked quiet things, books, late-night coffee, and the peaceful moment when a restaurant briefly paused between meals. What she did not particularly enjoy were customers who acted like the world existed solely for their convenience. Unfortunately, Whitford Grill attracted a fair number of them. Table 12 was the current example. Daniel Whitmore had arrived 40 minutes earlier wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than Emily's monthly rent. He had the kind of presence that made hosts stand straighter and managers appear instantly beside the table with polite smiles. Tall, early 30s, confident in a way that suggested success had followed him for a long time. Some customers tried to impress people with their wealth. Daniel Whitmore didn't bother. It simply followed him into the room. Emily had served him a ribeye steak and sparkling water while he conducted a business call that sounded complicated enough to involve numbers with several commas. She hadn't paid much attention. Waitresses learned quickly that overhearing the conversations of wealthy people rarely improved your day. Still, she noticed things. The watch on his wrist. The calm way he spoke even when discussing millions of dollars. The brief moment when he looked around the restaurant like someone searching for something he wasn't quite sure existed. And then his phone rang again. Daniel stood quickly, murmured an apology into the receiver, and walked toward the exit while continuing the conversation. He never looked back at the table. Emily cleared 2 nearby plates before approaching table 12 with her order pad ready to finalize the bill. The steak plate was empty. The water glass was half full, and in the center of the table sat a neat stack of crisp $100 bills. 10 of them. $1,000. For a moment, the restaurant seemed unusually quiet. Emily blinked once, then twice. The money didn't move. It simply sat there under the warm afternoon light, as if someone had forgotten a book or a pair of sunglasses. Except people rarely forgot $1,000. She glanced toward the front window where Daniel Whitmore had disappeared onto the sidewalk. No sign of him now. Just taxis and pedestrians and the distant sound of city traffic. A voice behind her whispered, "Emily, tell me that's what I think it is." It was Jake, another server, leaning slightly over her shoulder with wide eyes. "Looks like money," Emily said calmly. Jake let out a soft laugh. "Looks like 2 months of rent." Emily didn't respond right away. She simply studied the bills. Crisp edges. Fresh from the bank. The kind of money that didn't belong on a restaurant table unattended. Another server joined them. "Did he leave that as a tip?" someone asked. Jake shook his head quickly. "Nobody tips $1,000 at lunch." Emily folded her arms lightly. "He probably forgot it." Jake lowered his voice. "Or maybe he didn't." Emily turned toward him. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake shrugged. "Rich guys do weird stuff sometimes. Maybe it's a test. Maybe it's a tip. Maybe it's the universe finally apologizing for our paychecks." A few nearby servers laughed quietly. Emily didn't. She looked down at the money again, then reached into her apron and pulled out her pen. Slowly, carefully, she gathered the 10 bills into a neat stack. Jake watched closely. "You're not actually going to chase him down, are you?" Emily wrote something quickly on a small receipt slip. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate. "Sir, you forgot something at your table." She paused, then added one more line beneath it. "Also, the steak you ordered was medium rare, not medium well." Jake blinked in surprise. "You're leaving a note about the steak?" Emily folded the paper around the bills with quiet precision. "If someone's going to forget $1,000, she said calmly, They should at least know they ordered the steak wrong. Jake stared at her. You're unbelievable. Emily smiled slightly, slipped the folded bills into her apron pocket, and walked toward the door where the Manhattan sunlight waited outside. And across the street, standing beside a black sedan with his phone still in his hand, billionaire Daniel Whitmore had just finished his call. He turned toward the restaurant again at the exact moment Emily stepped onto the sidewalk, carrying the money he never expected to see again. Daniel Whitmore had just ended his call when he noticed the waitress stepping onto the sidewalk with a calm, determined stride that immediately caught his attention. For a brief moment he assumed she was simply heading out on a break, but then he saw the folded receipt and the unmistakable edge of green bills in her hand. His eyebrows lifted slightly. That was unexpected. Daniel had built a billion-dollar empire by predicting how people behaved around money. Most people did not return it. Most people hesitated, looked around, and quietly decided that opportunity had arrived disguised as luck. But the woman walking toward him did not look lucky. She looked mildly annoyed. Emily Parker stopped a few feet away from him and offered a polite but direct smile, the kind used by professionals who had spent years dealing with difficult customers without losing their patience. "Excuse me, sir," she said evenly. "You forgot something at your table." Daniel glanced down at the folded bills in her hand, then back at her face. The reaction he had prepared in his mind did not arrive. Instead, something close to curiosity appeared. "Did I?" he asked. Emily extended the money toward him without hesitation. "Yes, sir. $1,000. 10 $100 bills." Daniel did not take it immediately. Instead, he studied her expression carefully. She did not look impressed. She did not look nervous either. If anything, she looked like someone completing a routine task before returning to a long list of responsibilities. "You counted it," he said. "I always count money before handing it back," Emily replied. "It avoids misunderstandings." Daniel finally accepted the folded stack, though his eyes remained fixed on her face. Most people would not chase a stranger onto a Manhattan sidewalk to return $1,000. Emily shrugged lightly. Most people probably would not leave $1,000 on a restaurant table. For the first time since the conversation began, Daniel smiled. It was brief, but genuine. "Fair point." Emily nodded once, as if the matter were already resolved. "Have a nice afternoon, sir." She turned slightly, clearly intending to head back inside, but Daniel spoke again before she reached the door. "Wait." Emily stopped and turned back toward him. "Yes." Daniel unfolded the small receipt slip that had been wrapped around the money. He read the first line silently. "Sir, you forgot something at your table." Then his eyes moved to the second line. "Also, the steak you ordered was medium rare, not medium well." Daniel blinked once. Then he read it again. A quiet laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Emily folded her arms lightly. Was something unclear? Daniel looked up, still holding the note. "You wrote this?" "Yes." "You returned $1,000 and corrected my steak order in the same message." Emily tilted her head slightly. Both seemed equally important. Daniel laughed again, a little louder this time, and a passing pedestrian briefly glanced in their direction before continuing down the sidewalk. "You realize that most employees would avoid correcting a customer." Emily answered calmly. "Most customers do not accidentally order the wrong steak." Daniel studied her again, this time with more interest. "You are very confident for someone working a lunch shift." Emily gave a small shrug. "Confidence is free." The answer lingered in the air between them for a moment. Traffic passed along the street. A taxi honked somewhere in the distance. Inside the restaurant, a host opened the door to seat new guests. Daniel folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "I should probably explain something," he said. Emily raised an eyebrow slightly. "About the steak?" "About the money." Emily looked at the bills in his hand again, then back at his face. "All right." Daniel leaned casually against the black sedan parked behind him. "I did not forget that money." Emily's expression remained neutral. "No. No." Daniel nodded toward the restaurant windows. "There is a security camera pointed at table 12. Emily followed his gesture. Briefly, then returned her gaze to him. "You left it there on purpose." "Yes." "Why?" Daniel paused for a moment, as if deciding how honest he wanted to be. "Call it curiosity," he said finally. Emily waited. "I like observing how people behave when no one is watching." Emily glanced toward the restaurant again, then back at him. "Except you were watching." Daniel smiled slightly. "Exactly. Emily considered that for a moment. Then she said, "So the money was a test." Something like that. For who? Daniel met her eyes directly. For anyone who noticed it. Emily let out a quiet breath through her nose. That seems like a strange hobby. Daniel laughed again, clearly entertained. You have no idea. Emily looked at the restaurant door, then back at him once more. Well, your experiment is complete. The money is returned. She gestured lightly toward his hand. Congratulations. Daniel shook his head slowly. Actually, it just became more interesting. Emily frowned slightly. Why? Daniel held up the folded note between two fingers. Because the only person who passed the test also criticized my steak. Emily could not help smiling this time. Someone had to. Daniel watched her for another long moment before speaking again. Tell me something, Emily Parker. She blinked. You know my name? Daniel nodded toward the restaurant window again. Your name tag. Emily glanced down briefly, then looked back up. All right. What do you want to know? Daniel slipped the money back into his wallet. Why did you return it? Emily answered without hesitation. Because it was yours. Daniel tilted his head. That is the obvious answer. Emily shrugged. Sometimes the obvious answer is the correct one. Daniel considered that quietly. Then he said, You realize you just returned more money than most people make in 2 weeks. Emily nodded. Yes. And you did not even hesitate. Emily smiled faintly. I hesitated about the steak. Daniel laughed again, shaking his head in disbelief. For the first time that afternoon, the billionaire who had expected to observe a simple human experiment realized something had gone slightly wrong. Instead of learning about temptation, he had discovered someone who seemed completely unimpressed by the entire situation. And somehow that made the experiment far more interesting than he had planned. Emily Parker stood on the sidewalk for another moment after Daniel Whitmore finished speaking, studying him with the calm curiosity of someone trying to understand whether a situation was serious or simply ridiculous. The afternoon sun reflected off nearby office windows, and a soft breeze moved along the avenue carrying the distant smell of street food carts and fresh coffee. Daniel noticed something unusual in her expression. She was not impressed. She was not intimidated. She was evaluating him the same way a teacher might evaluate a student who had just made a questionable decision. So let me understand this correctly, Emily said slowly. You leave money on a table to watch what people do. Daniel nodded once. Yes. And you think that tells you something meaningful about them? Usually it does. Emily tilted her head slightly. Or maybe it just tells you who is desperate enough to need the money. Daniel paused. That answer had not appeared in any of his previous observations. For a moment he said nothing. Emily continued, her tone thoughtful rather than accusatory. $1,000 could change someone's month. Rent, groceries, a medical bill. She glanced briefly down the street before returning her eyes to him. Sometimes temptation is not about character. Sometimes it is about survival. Daniel studied her face carefully. There was no anger there. Just quiet honesty. You are saying my experiment is flawed, he said. Emily shrugged lightly. I am saying real life is complicated. The answer hung in the air between them for several seconds. A black SUV drove past slowly, and somewhere behind them a delivery truck rolled up to the restaurant entrance. Daniel finally pushed himself away from the side of the sedan and crossed his arms thoughtfully. You still return the money. Emily nodded. Yes. Why? Emily smiled faintly. Because it was yours. Daniel shook his head slowly. That is still the obvious answer. Emily considered that for a moment before speaking again. All right. The honest answer. Daniel raised an eyebrow with interest. Please. Emily looked directly at him. Because if I had kept it, I would spend the rest of the week wondering whether you came back for it. Daniel laughed softly. So your conscience is practical. My conscience likes sleep, Emily replied. Daniel could not help smiling again. Something about the way she spoke made every answer feel refreshingly simple. No performance. No attempt to impress him. Just straightforward reasoning. After a moment he asked, How long have you worked here? Emily glanced toward the restaurant door. About a year. Full time. 2 jobs actually. Daniel's interest sharpened slightly. 2. Emily nodded. Morning shifts here. Evening shifts at a bookstore 3 blocks away. Daniel looked mildly surprised. You work in a bookstore after working in a restaurant all day. Emily smiled. The bookstore is quieter. You like quiet. Very much. Daniel studied her again, noticing details he had not paid attention to earlier. The way she stood with relaxed confidence. the faint ink mark on her hand from writing orders all afternoon. The paperback book tucked slightly into her apron pocket. "What are you reading?" he asked suddenly. Emily blinked. "What?" Daniel gestured toward her apron. "The book." Emily glanced down and pulled the small paperback out halfway. The cover was worn from frequent use. Daniel leaned slightly to read the title. It was a book about behavioral economics. His eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "That is not typical restaurant break reading." Emily slid the book back into her apron. "It keeps my brain busy." Daniel laughed quietly. "And here I thought you spent your breaks judging steak orders." Emily smiled. "That too." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Traffic moved steadily down the avenue. Inside the restaurant, a group of new customers began filling the lunch tables. Finally, Emily looked toward the door again. "I should get back inside. My manager already thinks I take long breaks." Daniel nodded, but did not move aside immediately. "Before you go, can I ask you one more question?" Emily waited. "What would you have done if the money had been $5,000 instead of $1,000? Emily did not hesitate. "Returned it." Daniel tilted his head slightly. $10,000. "Returned it." Daniel smiled. $50,000. Emily crossed her arms lightly. "At that point, I might assume you had a serious wallet problem." Daniel laughed again, shaking his head. "You are difficult to test." Emily shrugged. "Maybe you were testing the wrong things." Daniel considered that quietly. Then he asked, "What should I be testing?" Emily looked at him for a moment, as if weighing whether to answer honestly. Then she said, "Kindness." Daniel blinked. "Kindness." Emily nodded. "Leave someone a chance to help another person, not a chance to take something." Daniel thought about that for several seconds. The idea felt strangely simple, almost obvious. Yet he realized he had never designed an experiment like that before. Finally, he smiled slowly. "You may have just improved my research." Emily laughed softly. "Good luck with that." She stepped past him and reached for the restaurant door handle, but before she disappeared inside, Daniel spoke again. "Emily." She paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Yes." Daniel Whitmore looked at the restaurant, then at her again with a thoughtful expression that suggested a new idea had just arrived. "What are you doing after your shift ends tonight?" Emily raised an eyebrow slowly, clearly recognizing the beginning of a very different kind of question. Emily Parker paused with her hand resting on the restaurant door handle, the glass reflecting a faint image of the busy dining room behind her and the quiet Manhattan sidewalk in front of her. For a brief moment, she did not turn around. Instead, she stared through the window at the familiar scene inside Whitford Grill. Plates moving, waiters walking quickly between tables, a host greeting a new group near the entrance. The rhythm of the place she had worked in for nearly a year. Then she slowly turned back toward Daniel Whitmore, the billionaire who had apparently just asked her a question that did not belong in the middle of a lunch shift conversation. Her eyebrow lifted slightly, the same expression she had used earlier when questioning his experiment with money. "Why?" she asked calmly. Daniel leaned casually against the black sedan again, but this time his posture carried a different tone. Not curiosity exactly, something closer to interest. "Because," he said thoughtfully, "you just improved my understanding of human behavior in under 10 minutes. Emily folded her arms lightly. "That seems unlikely." Daniel smiled. "You would be surprised how rarely people disagree with me." Emily glanced toward the restaurant door again. "You probably talked to the wrong people." Daniel laughed quietly. "That is possible." A taxi drove past them, its driver glancing briefly toward the pair before continuing down the street. Daniel pushed himself upright and took a small step closer, though he kept a respectful distance. "Let me try that again," he said. "What are you doing after work tonight?" Emily studied him carefully for a moment. "Working," she answered. Daniel blinked. "Working?" Emily nodded. "At the bookstore." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Right. The quiet place." "Exactly." Daniel considered this for a second. "What time does that shift end?" Emily hesitated, clearly deciding whether answering the question was worth the effort. 9:30. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, as if making a note in his mind. "Good." Emily frowned slightly. "Good for what?" Daniel gave a small shrug. "For dinner." Emily stared at him for a moment, then laughed softly in disbelief. "You are asking me to dinner?" Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Emily looked around the sidewalk briefly, then back at him. "You realize I am still in the middle of my shift." Daniel glanced at his watch. "And you will be done eventually." Emily shook her head slowly. "You do this often? Ask people to dinner?" Ask waitresses to dinner. Daniel smiled slightly. No. Emily narrowed her eyes just a little, studying his face as if trying to determine whether he was joking. Then why me? Daniel answered without hesitation. Because you returned the money. Emily rolled her eyes lightly. That cannot be your entire reason. Daniel thought for a moment. All right. Because you returned the money, criticized my steak, questioned my experiment, and recommended a better one. Emily could not help smiling again. That does sound slightly more reasonable. Daniel gestured toward the restaurant behind her. Also because you are the first person I have met today who was not impressed by my wallet. Emily replied instantly. Your wallet was impressive. It was just not mine. Daniel laughed again. The sound felt lighter now, less guarded than when the conversation had started. For a moment the two of them stood there on the sidewalk with the afternoon traffic passing around them and the steady rhythm of city life continuing as if nothing unusual were happening. Finally Emily said, You realize I do not know you. Daniel nodded. That is usually how conversations begin. Emily considered that. You might be a very strange person. Daniel shrugged. That is also possible. Emily looked at the restaurant door again. Through the glass, she could see her manager scanning the dining room, probably wondering where his server had disappeared. She sighed quietly. If I stand out here any longer, I am going to get fired. Daniel nodded toward the door. Then you should go back inside. Emily reached for the handle again, but stopped halfway. One question. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Yes. Emily looked at him directly. What happens if I say no? Daniel thought about that for a moment before answering honestly. Then I will respect that answer. Emily studied his expression carefully. And you will not leave another $1,000 on the table as a bribe. Daniel laughed softly. No bribes. Emily smiled faintly. Good. She opened the door slightly, then paused one last time and looked back over her shoulder. 9:30, she said. Daniel nodded once. 9:30. Emily disappeared inside Whitford Grill and the door closed quietly behind her, leaving Daniel Whitmore standing alone on the sidewalk with an unfamiliar realization settling slowly into his mind. For the first time in a long time, a carefully planned experiment had turned into something completely unpredictable. And somehow he suspected that dinner later that evening might reveal far more about human behavior than a stack of forgotten money ever could. Emily Parker pushed the restaurant door closed behind her and immediately stepped back into the rhythm of the dining room as if the conversation on the sidewalk had never happened. Plates clinked softly, glasses reflected the warm afternoon light, and the smell of grilled steak and fresh bread filled the air. Jake spotted her first and hurried over with an expression that mixed curiosity with dramatic excitement. So, he whispered quickly. Emily picked up a tray from the service station and balanced it on one hand. So what? Jake blinked. You chased down a billionaire with $1,000. Do not tell me nothing interesting happened. Emily began walking toward table 7 with calm efficiency. I returned the money. Jake followed beside her like an investigative reporter who refused to give up the story. And Emily set down a glass of iced tea in front of a customer and smiled politely before turning back toward Jake. And he admitted he left it there on purpose. Jake stopped walking. Wait. What? Emily shrugged lightly. Apparently, it was some kind of social experiment. Jake's eyes widened dramatically. You are kidding. No, Jake leaned closer. Did you pass the test? Emily continued toward the kitchen without slowing down. Apparently. Jake shook his head in disbelief. That is unbelievable. Emily placed the empty tray on the counter and grabbed another order ticket. It was actually fairly predictable. Jake folded his arms. Predictable? A billionaire leaving $1,000 on a table is predictable. Emily picked up 2 plates from the counter. People with too much money often invent strange hobbies. Jake watched. Her walk passed again. Did he say anything else? Emily paused for half a second. He asked me to dinner. Jake nearly dropped the stack of menus he was holding. He did what? Emily continued walking calmly toward the dining room. Dinner. Jake hurried after her again. And Emily placed a plate in front of a customer. And what? Jake lowered his voice again. Did you say yes? Emily took a slow breath and glanced toward the front window where the sidewalk outside was barely visible through the reflection of afternoon light. I said 9:30. Jake stared at her. You said yes. Emily shrugged. Technically, I said when my shift ends. Jake ran a hand through his hair. Emily, do you understand what just happened? Emily looked at him with mild amusement. Yes. A man asked me to dinner. Jake shook his head rapidly. Not just a man. That is Daniel Whitmore. Emily paused slightly. You know who he is? Jake gave her a look that suggested the entire city knew who he was. Technology investor. Real estate. Media companies. That guy owns half the buildings downtown. Emily lifted an eyebrow slightly. That seems inconvenient. Jake stared at her again. You are unbelievable. Emily smiled faintly and walked back toward the kitchen as another group of customers entered the restaurant. The afternoon continued moving forward with the same steady rhythm as before. Orders were taken. Plates were delivered. Coffee was poured. Yet every once in a while, Emily caught Jake staring at her like she had just stepped out of a headline. Hours passed quietly. By the time the dinner crowd began arriving, the sun had started sinking between the tall buildings outside, and the dining room lights cast a warm glow across the polished tables. Emily wiped down the last table in her section and checked the clock on the wall above the bar. 9:15. 15 minutes left. Jake approached again, this time carrying 2 empty glasses. He is still out there. Emily looked up. What? Jake nodded toward the front window. Black sedan. Same guy. Same suit. Emily walked slowly toward the entrance and glanced through the glass. Parked along the curb was the same black car from earlier. Daniel Whitmore leaned casually against the side of it, scrolling through his phone with the relaxed patience of someone who did not appear concerned about the passing. Hours. Emily stared for a moment longer than she expected. Jake leaned beside her. He has been there for a while. Emily shook her head slightly. Why? Jake shrugged. Maybe he takes dinner very seriously. Emily looked down at her apron and untied the strings slowly. Or maybe he is stubborn. Jake smiled. Maybe both. Emily folded the apron neatly and placed it on the counter beside the register. Her shift was finished. The restaurant manager waved casually from across the room. Good work tonight, Emily. She nodded politely and walked toward the door with calm, measured steps. Jake followed a few feet behind, like someone watching the final scene of a movie he was not sure he believed. Emily opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk once again. The air had cooled slightly as evening settled over the city. Daniel Whitmore looked up from his phone almost immediately and smiled when he saw her. Right on time, he said. Emily folded her arms lightly. You waited 4 hours. Daniel slipped his phone into his pocket. You said 9:30. Emily glanced at the car, then back at him. Most people would have left. Daniel smiled again, calm and patient. Most people would have kept the money. Emily could not help laughing quietly at that answer. For the first time since the strange experiment began, she realized something surprising. The billionaire who had tried to study human behavior might have just discovered that patience was a better test than money. Emily Parker stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer, studying Daniel Whitmore with the same quiet curiosity she had shown since the beginning of their strange afternoon. The city around them had shifted into its evening rhythm. Streetlights had begun glowing softly along the avenue. Office workers moved past in steady streams, and somewhere nearby a saxophone player filled the air with slow jazz drifting through the cool night air. Daniel opened the passenger door of the black sedan and gestured politely. Would you like to sit? Emily looked at the car, then back at him. Is that necessary? Daniel smiled slightly. It is more comfortable than standing on the sidewalk. Emily considered that for a moment before walking around the front of the car and sliding into the passenger seat. The interior smelled faintly of leather and fresh coffee. Daniel closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side before settling behind the wheel. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt surprisingly comfortable. Daniel finally started the engine and pulled slowly away from the curb. I have been thinking about what you said earlier, he said as the car merged into traffic. Emily looked out the window at the passing lights of Manhattan. About the steak? Daniel laughed softly. About kindness. Emily turned back toward him slightly. That seemed to bother you. Daniel shook his head. Not bother. Challenge. Emily nodded thoughtfully. Good experiments usually start with better questions. Daniel glanced at her briefly with an amused expression. You keep treating my life like a research project. Emily smiled faintly. You started it. The car moved smoothly through the city streets while restaurants and storefronts glowed under the evening lights. After a few blocks, Emily finally asked, Where are we going? Daniel answered casually. Dinner. Emily raised an eyebrow. Somewhere expensive? Daniel thought for a moment. Do you want somewhere expensive? Emily leaned back slightly in the seat and looked out the window again. No. Daniel nodded once as if he had expected that answer. A few minutes later, he turned the car down a quieter street and pulled into a small parking spot beside a corner diner with a bright neon sign glowing above the door. Emily stared at the building for a moment. You are joking. Daniel shut off the engine. No. Emily looked at the sign again. This place sells grilled cheese sandwiches. Daniel smiled. And apparently you are an expert on food quality. Emily laughed softly. You waited 4 hours to take me to a diner. Daniel opened his door and stepped out. Technically, you spent 8 hours serving steak. Emily followed him out of the car, still smiling in disbelief. That is a very strange argument. Daniel held the door open for her as they entered the diner together. Inside, the place was warm and simple. A few late-night customers sat in booths drinking coffee, while a small radio played quiet music behind the counter. The waitress behind the register greeted them with a friendly nod. Emily slid into a booth near the window while Daniel sat across from her. For a moment, they both studied the menu, even though it was only a single laminated page. Emily finally looked up. You are serious about this? Grilled cheese. Daniel nodded. Completely serious. Emily laughed again and shook her head. You are the first billionaire I have met who takes a waitress to a diner for dinner. Daniel folded the menu closed. You are the first waitress I have met who returned $1,000 and corrected my steak order in the same sentence. Emily rested her elbows lightly on the table and looked at him with calm curiosity. So what happens now? Daniel leaned back slightly in the booth. Now we test your theory. Emily frowned slightly. Which theory? Daniel gestured around the small diner. Kindness. Emily glanced around the room before looking back at him. You brought me here to test kindness. Daniel smiled. You said I was testing the wrong things. Emily considered that for a moment before nodding slowly. All right. Daniel leaned forward slightly across the table. So tell me something, Emily Parker. She raised an eyebrow again. Yes. Daniel's voice carried the same quiet curiosity it had all afternoon. If money is not the best way to understand people, what is? Emily watched him for a moment, then smiled gently as if the answer had always been obvious. Time. Daniel blinked once. Time. Emily nodded. Money shows what people want. Time shows what they value. Daniel leaned back again slowly as her words settled into his thoughts. Outside the diner window, the city lights continued glowing while traffic moved steadily down the avenue. And somewhere between the grilled cheese menu and a quiet conversation about human nature, Daniel Whitmore realized that the most interesting experiment of his life had quietly begun the moment a waitress chose honesty over $1,000. Daniel Whitmore sat quietly for a moment after Emily finished speaking, her words lingering in the small diner like the warm smell of grilled bread and melted cheese drifting from the kitchen. Money shows what people want. Time shows what they value. It sounded simple when she said it, but Daniel realized he had spent most of his adult life measuring the world using the first one and almost never the second. The waitress arrived with 2 plates and placed them on the table with the easy rhythm of someone who had repeated the motion thousands of times. 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, she said with a friendly smile before walking away again. Emily looked down at the plate and laughed softly. You are really committing to this experiment. Daniel picked up the sandwich and studied it like a scientist examining a specimen. You would be surprised how many important conversations happen over simple food. Emily raised an eyebrow. And how many billion-dollar deals? Daniel smiled. Exactly. They began eating slowly while the quiet diner hummed around them. A couple in the corner booth shared a slice of pie while an older man at the counter read a newspaper under the soft yellow lights. Nothing about the place suggested power or wealth. It was simply a room where people came to eat and rest after long days. Emily dipped her sandwich into the soup and glanced at Daniel across the table. So what exactly do you do all day? Daniel wiped his hands with a napkin and leaned back slightly. I invest in companies. Emily nodded. Technology? Daniel tilted his head slightly. You know that already. Emily smiled faintly. Jake mentioned it. Daniel laughed quietly. Your coworker seems very enthusiastic. Emily shrugged. He likes headlines. Daniel studied her for a moment before asking. And you? 2 jobs and behavioral economics books during lunch breaks. Emily stirred the soup slowly with her spoon as she considered how to answer. I like understanding how people think. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. So you study behavior. Emily shrugged. Mostly I observe it. Daniel smiled. Then today must have been entertaining. Emily looked at him across the table. You left $1,000 on a table to test strangers. Daniel raised his hands slightly in surrender. Point taken. Emily continued calmly. Then you waited 4 hours on a sidewalk to see if I would show up for dinner. Daniel blinked once. You noticed that? Emily smiled gently. Time shows what people value. Daniel could not help laughing again. The logic was impossible to argue with. After a moment he asked, What about you? Emily raised an eyebrow. What about me? What do you value? Emily took a slow sip of her soup before answering. Peace. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Peace. Emily nodded toward the window where the quiet street lights illuminated the sidewalk outside. Quiet places. Honest conversations. Work that means something. Daniel listened carefully. Her answer sounded simple, but carried the calm certainty of someone who had thought about it often. In a bookstore, he added. Emily smiled. In a bookstore. 4. A few minutes they ate quietly while the conversation settled into a comfortable rhythm. Eventually Daniel leaned forward again, resting his elbows lightly on the table. Emily. She looked up. Yes. Daniel's voice softened slightly. Can I tell you something honestly? Emily nodded. You have been honest all evening. Daniel shook his head slowly. Not entirely. Emily waited patiently. Daniel looked down at the table for a moment before speaking again. When I left that money on the table this afternoon, I expected someone to take it. Emily raised an eyebrow slightly. You sounded confident about that. Daniel nodded. Because it usually happens. Emily did not seem surprised. Daniel continued quietly. But even if someone returned it, I assumed they would be nervous or grateful. Emily leaned back slightly in the booth. Instead, you got a note about your steak. Daniel laughed softly. Exactly. Emily smiled gently. You were expecting a test result. Daniel nodded slowly. And instead I met a person. The words lingered in the air for a moment. Emily looked down at the table, then back up at him. That is usually what happens when you talk to people instead of studying them. Daniel smiled at that answer. Outside the diner window, a light breeze moved through the quiet street, while the city continued its endless evening rhythm. Finally, Daniel asked one more question, his voice carrying the same calm curiosity that had started everything hours earlier. Emily Parker, do you believe people can change the way they see the world? Emily looked at him thoughtfully for a moment before answering with a quiet certainty that felt both gentle and powerful at the same time. Yes, she said softly. But usually it takes meeting the right person. Daniel Whitmore remained quiet for several seconds after Emily spoke those words, the simple sentence settling somewhere deeper in his thoughts than he expected. Usually it takes meeting the right person. The diner lights hummed softly above them while the older man at the counter folded his newspaper and asked for another cup of coffee. Outside the window, the city continued its steady rhythm, headlights passing across the glass in slow-moving reflections. Daniel finally leaned back in the booth and looked at Emily with a thoughtful expression that had replaced the casual confidence he carried earlier in the day. That sounds like a very optimistic theory, he said. Emily dipped the corner of her grilled cheese sandwich into the tomato soup and answered calmly. It is not optimism. Daniel tilted his head slightly. No. Emily shook her head gently. It is observation. Daniel smiled faintly at that word. You observe a lot. Emily nodded. When you spend all day serving people food, you learn how they talk to each other, how they treat strangers, how they react when things go wrong. Daniel studied her with genuine interest. And what have you learned? Emily took a moment before answering, as if choosing the right words carefully. Most people think they are the main character in every room. Daniel laughed quietly. That is probably accurate. Emily smiled slightly. But sometimes they meet someone who makes them see the room differently. Daniel rested his hands together on the table as he listened. Emily continued, her tone thoughtful rather than dramatic. Someone who challenges them. Someone who refuses to play the expected role. Daniel nodded slowly. Like the waitress who returns $1,000. Emily raised an eyebrow again. Or the billionaire who waits 4 hours outside a restaurant. Daniel laughed again, but this time the sound carried a quieter sincerity. Fair point. For a moment, they both returned to eating while the conversation settled into a comfortable silence. The grilled cheese sandwiches were simple but warm, the kind of meal that felt unexpectedly satisfying after a long day. After a few minutes, Daniel spoke again. Do you know something strange? Emily looked up. What? Daniel glanced around the small diner before answering. I have had dinners that cost $2,000 per person. Emily leaned back slightly in the booth. That sounds exhausting. Daniel smiled. It usually is. Emily nodded. Too many forks? Daniel laughed. Exactly. Emily gestured lightly toward the diner around them. Here you only need one. Daniel followed her gesture and looked around the quiet room again. The waitress behind the counter was pouring coffee for the older man, while the radio played a slow country song that almost nobody seemed to notice. You know, Daniel said thoughtfully, I spend most of my time in places where everyone is trying to impress someone. Emily rested her chin lightly on her hand as she listened. Daniel continued, his voice quieter now. Investors impressing investors. Executives impressing executives. Everyone performing. Emily nodded slowly. That sounds tiring. Daniel looked at her again. It is. Emily gave a small sympathetic smile. You should try working a lunch rush. Daniel laughed. That might be the more intense environment. Emily nodded with complete seriousness. Definitely. Their eyes met for a moment, and both of them smiled at the same time. The kind of shared amusement that appears when two people realize they are enjoying the same moment. Eventually Daniel reached for the bill when the waitress set it on the table. Emily noticed immediately. Do not even think about leaving $1,000. Daniel raised his hand slightly. I promise. Emily watched him carefully as he placed a reasonable tip on the receipt and slid the bill folder back toward the edge of the table. See, Daniel said lightly. I can behave normally. Emily smiled. I am proud of you. They stood up and walked toward the door together. When they stepped outside, the night air had cooled further, and the street had grown quieter than it had been earlier in the evening. Daniel unlocked the car, but did not open the door right away. Instead, he leaned against the side of the sedan again and looked at Emily with a thoughtful expression. Tonight was interesting, he said. Emily folded her arms lightly. Your experiments are improving. Daniel nodded. Thanks to you. Emily tilted her head slightly. Do not get used to it. Daniel smiled. Too late. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence did not feel awkward. It felt comfortable in the same quiet way their conversation inside the diner had felt. Finally, Daniel said, Can I ask you one more question? Emily raised an eyebrow. You ask a lot of questions. Daniel nodded. It is part of my job. Emily sighed dramatically, but smiled. All right. Daniel looked directly at her as he spoke, his tone more sincere than playful this time. If someone wanted to change the way they see the world, where would they start? Emily thought about that for a moment before answering softly. By spending time with people who see it differently. Daniel nodded slowly as if the answer made perfect sense. Then he smiled again and said quietly, In that case, Emily Parker, I hope this is not the last time we have dinner together. Emily studied his face for a moment before replying with the same calm honesty that had guided every decision she made. That day? That depends, she said gently. Daniel waited. Emily smiled. Next time you order the steak correctly. Daniel laughed as the city lights reflected off the quiet street behind them. And for the first time since the strange afternoon began, the billionaire realized that the most valuable thing he had discovered that day was not an experiment about money, but a conversation he did not want to end. The city night had grown quieter by the time Emily Parker and Daniel Whitmore finally stepped away from the small diner and walked slowly back toward the black sedan parked under the streetlight. The neon sign behind them flickered softly while the last few customers inside finished their coffee. Emily slipped her hands into the pockets of her light jacket as the cool evening air brushed gently across the sidewalk. Daniel opened the passenger door again, but this time Emily did not step inside immediately. Instead, she looked down the street, watching a passing bus glide through the intersection before turning back toward him. You know something? She said thoughtfully. Daniel leaned lightly against the car door. What is that? Emily smiled faintly. This might be the strangest dinner invitation I have ever accepted. Daniel laughed quietly. Strange can be interesting. Emily tilted her head slightly. You seem very comfortable with strange situations. Daniel nodded slowly. I spend most of my life solving unpredictable problems. Emily crossed her arms lightly. Yet today you seem surprised more than once. Daniel smiled. That is because I did not plan on meeting someone who refused to behave according to my predictions. Emily raised an eyebrow. You keep saying that like it is unusual. Daniel opened the car door wider and gestured for her to sit. It is. Emily finally slid into the passenger seat again and Daniel walked around to the driver's side before starting the engine. The car moved smoothly through the quiet street as they began heading back toward the brighter part of the city. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Emily watched the reflections of passing lights glide across the window while Daniel focused calmly on the road ahead. Eventually, Emily broke the silence. "So tell me something honestly." Daniel glanced toward her briefly. "All right." Emily turned slightly in her seat. "How often do your experiments actually teach you something new?" Daniel thought about that question carefully before answering. "Not as often as I would like." Emily nodded slowly. "That sounds about right." Daniel smiled. "You sound like someone who has tested a few theories herself." Emily looked out the window again as the car passed a row of late-night coffee shops glowing softly along the sidewalk. "Working in restaurants is a constant study of human behavior." Daniel nodded. "You said that earlier." Emily turned back toward him. "You see people celebrating birthdays, arguing about money, proposing marriage, breaking up relationships." Daniel listened with quiet attention. Emily continued calmly. "Sometimes all in the same evening." Daniel laughed softly. "That does sound like a useful research environment." Emily smiled faintly. "It teaches you one thing very quickly." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Emily answered simply. "People reveal their true character when they believe no one important is watching." Daniel considered that statement for a moment before responding. "Which is exactly why I left the money on the table." Emily nodded slightly. "Yes." Daniel glanced at her again. "But you added something I had never considered." Emily waited. "You said survival changes the meaning of temptation." Emily looked at him with calm certainty. "It does." Daniel slowed the car at a red light and rested his hands loosely on the steering wheel while the city traffic paused around them. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I built my entire career on predicting what people would do when money was involved." Emily watched the traffic light above the intersection glow red against the dark sky. "And today?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Today I learned that sometimes the more interesting question is why someone refuses the money." The light turned green and the car moved forward again. Emily leaned back comfortably in the seat as the buildings outside grew taller and brighter. Eventually Daniel turned onto a quieter street near the bookstore Emily had mentioned earlier. He pulled the car to the curb and turned off the engine. The street was calm, illuminated by warm yellow lamps and the soft glow of storefront windows preparing to close for the night. Emily looked at the familiar sign of the bookstore across the sidewalk and smiled gently. "You remembered." Daniel nodded. "You said you liked quiet places." Emily turned toward him again. "Thank you for dinner." Daniel smiled. "Thank you for the conversation." For a moment, they both sat quietly inside the parked car while the night air settled peacefully around them. Emily finally opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk. Daniel followed and leaned lightly against the side of the car again. Emily looked at him with the same thoughtful curiosity she had shown since the beginning of their unusual day. "So what happens next, Daniel Whitmore?" Daniel slipped his hands into his coat pockets and answered honestly. "I suspect the experiment continues." Emily smiled slightly. "Your research never ends, does it?" Daniel shook his head. "Not when I am learning something new." Emily studied him for a moment before replying softly. "Then maybe next time you should try a different test." Daniel raised an eyebrow with interest. "What kind of test?" Emily took a step backward toward the bookstore entrance and smiled with quiet confidence. "The kind where you see whether two people who started the day as strangers might actually enjoy seeing each other again." Daniel looked at her for a moment before a slow smile spread across his face. "That sounds like a very promising experiment." Emily nodded once and opened the bookstore door, the warm light from inside spilling softly onto the quiet sidewalk as she disappeared into the calm world she had described earlier. Daniel remained standing beside the car for a few seconds longer, realizing that the most unexpected part of his entire day was not the waitress who returned the money, but the possibility that the next chapter of the experiment might not involve money at all. The quiet bell above the bookstore door rang softly as Emily Parker stepped inside, bringing with her the cool night air and the faint echo of the conversation she had just left behind on the sidewalk. The shop was nearly empty at this hour. Warm yellow lights reflected across rows of wooden shelves filled with novels, biographies, and quiet stories waiting patiently for someone to open them. Emily walked behind the counter and placed her bag on the small stool beside the register, but for a moment she did not begin working. Instead, she glanced through the front window where Daniel Whitmore was still standing beside his car under the streetlight. He had not driven away yet. Outside, Daniel leaned casually against the black sedan, looking up toward the bookstore window with a thoughtful expression that suggested the evening had given him more to think about than any business meeting had in months. Eventually, he straightened, slipped into the driver's seat, and pulled away slowly from the curb. Emily watched the car disappear down the quiet street before finally turning back to the calm world of books around her. The bookstore had its own rhythm. Soft music played somewhere in the background. The scent of paper and polished wood filled the air. Emily moved quietly between the shelves, returning a few books to their proper places, her mind drifting back to the unexpected events of the afternoon. $1,000 on a restaurant table. A billionaire who liked experiments. A dinner that felt strangely simple and comfortable at the same time. She shook her head slightly and smiled to herself before returning to the counter. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore guided the car through the late-night traffic with a calm focus that usually belonged to business strategy sessions rather than dinner conversations. The streets of Manhattan stretched ahead in quiet lines of light, while his mind replayed the evening with unusual clarity. Most days Daniel spent his time evaluating numbers, opportunities, and risks. Yet tonight the most valuable insight had come from a waitress who studied human behavior between serving lunch and selling books. Money shows what people want. Time shows what they value. The words returned again and again as he drove. Daniel finally pulled into the underground parking garage of his apartment building and shut off the engine. The silence inside the car felt different than usual. Less rushed, more thoughtful. He stepped out and rode the elevator up to his apartment, where the city skyline stretched across the tall windows like a sea of quiet stars. Normally, he would have opened his laptop immediately to review financial reports or prepare for the next day's meetings. Instead, he walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood for a moment looking out across the glowing skyline. Somewhere in the city, Emily Parker was shelving books and helping customers find quiet stories to read before bed. Daniel smiled slightly at the thought. The next morning arrived quickly. Sunlight poured across the office windows of Whitmore Capital while Daniel's executive team gathered around the large conference table waiting for their daily meeting to begin. Investors spoke about markets. Analysts presented reports. Assistants moved quietly between chairs distributing printed documents. Yet Daniel noticed something unusual about his own attention that morning. For the first time in years, the endless numbers and projections felt less interesting than a simple conversation in a small diner the night before. Halfway through the meeting, one of his partners leaned forward. "Daniel, what do you think?" Daniel blinked slightly as he returned to the present moment. "About what?" The room fell quiet for a second before the partner repeated the question about a potential acquisition. Daniel listened carefully, asked a few thoughtful questions, and offered his decision with the same calm clarity that had built his reputation. But as the meeting ended and the executives slowly left the conference room, Daniel remained seated for a moment longer. He opened his phone and looked at the screen thoughtfully. Across town, the bookstore door opened as Emily welcomed the first customers of the morning with her usual calm smile. The quiet routine of arranging books and helping readers had already begun. Her phone rested inside her bag beneath the counter, silent and forgotten among receipts and notes from the previous day. Daniel finally typed a short message before setting the phone down on the conference table. Across the city, Emily's phone vibrated softly inside her bag while she was helping an elderly customer search for a mystery novel on the back shelf. Several minutes later, she returned to the counter, opened her bag, and noticed the notification. She read the message slowly, and a small smile appeared on her face before she even realized it. The message was simple. "Dinner experiment number 2 tonight?" Emily Parker stood behind the small wooden counter of the bookstore for several seconds after reading the message, the quiet shop around her continuing its gentle morning rhythm as if nothing unusual had happened. The sunlight filtered softly through the tall front window, painting warm rectangles of light across the wooden floor, while a few early customers browsed the shelves in peaceful silence. "Dinner experiment number 2 tonight?" Emily read the message again and shook her head slightly with a quiet smile that she quickly tried to hide. The elderly man she had helped earlier walked toward the register carrying a paperback mystery novel. Emily set the phone down beside the receipt book and greeted him with her usual calm politeness. Did you find something you like? She asked. The man nodded happily. This author never disappoints. Emily scanned the book and handed him the receipt with a warm smile. Enjoy the story. When he left the store, the bell above the door rang softly again and the quiet returned. Emily glanced at the phone once more before typing a reply. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully choosing the words. Only if the steak is ordered correctly this time. She hesitated for a moment before pressing send. Across the city in the glass conference room of Whitmore Capital, Daniel Whitmore was reviewing financial projections with two analysts when his phone vibrated gently on the table beside him. Normally, he ignored messages during meetings, but something about this particular conversation made him reach for the phone almost immediately. He read Emily's reply, and a small smile appeared before he even realized it. One of the analysts noticed and paused mid-sentence. Is everything all right? Daniel set the phone down again and nodded. Yes. The analyst continued the presentation while Daniel's attention returned to the charts and reports in front of him, but the quiet amusement in his expression did not completely disappear. Hours later, the workday ended as it always did, with a steady flow of emails, decisions, and phone calls. Yet Daniel noticed something unusual about the way the afternoon passed. For the first time in a long while, he found himself checking the time with the same quiet anticipation that most people associated with a personal plan rather than a business deadline. Evening slowly arrived across the city again. In the bookstore, Emily closed the final register, stacked the last returned books on the counter, and turned the small sign on the door from open to closed. The warm lights inside the shop reflected softly against the quiet street outside. She slipped her phone into her bag just as it vibrated again. This time the message was simple. 7:30. Same diner. Emily laughed softly to herself and stepped outside into the cool evening air. Meanwhile, Daniel parked the black sedan in the same spot near the small diner they had visited the night before. The neon sign glowed quietly above the entrance while the faint smell of grilled bread drifted from the kitchen vents into the street. Daniel leaned lightly against the car again. The same place where the strange chain of events had begun the day before, though this time he was not running an experiment or observing a stranger. A few minutes later, Emily turned the corner and spotted him under the streetlight. She walked toward him with calm, steady steps and stopped a few feet away. You really like this place, she said lightly. Daniel smiled. It passed the kindness test. Emily laughed softly. You invented that test yesterday. Daniel shrugged. Good ideas can appear quickly. Emily glanced toward the diner door. And the steak experiment. Daniel raised both hands in surrender. No steak tonight. Emily nodded with mock seriousness. Wise decision. They stepped inside together and took the same booth near the window. The waitress recognized them and greeted them with a friendly smile. Back again already? She asked. Daniel nodded. Apparently we started a research project. The waitress laughed and handed them menus, even though both of them already knew what they would order. After she walked away, Emily looked across the table at Daniel with a thoughtful expression. So what is tonight's experiment? Daniel leaned back comfortably in the booth. Tonight, I am testing a different theory. Emily tilted her head slightly. Which one? Daniel answered calmly. Whether two people who started as strangers yesterday might actually enjoy each other's company again today. Emily smiled gently, the same quiet smile that had appeared when she first returned the $1,000 on the restaurant table. That seems like a very simple experiment. Daniel nodded slowly. Sometimes the most interesting results come from the simplest questions. And as the waitress returned with 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and 2 bowls of tomato soup, both of them realized that the strange experiment that began with money was quietly turning into something far more meaningful than either of them had expected. The small diner felt almost familiar now as Emily Parker and Daniel Whitmore sat across from each other in the same booth by the window, the soft glow of the streetlights reflecting faintly against the glass beside them. The waitress placed the grilled cheese sandwiches and bowls of tomato soup on the table with an amused smile before walking away, leaving the quiet hum of the diner to settle around them again. Emily looked down at the plate for a moment before glancing back up at Daniel. You are becoming predictable, she said lightly. Daniel lifted his sandwich and smiled. That is not something I hear often. Emily dipped the corner of her sandwich into the soup. Most billionaires probably prefer fancy restaurants. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Most billionaires probably do not get corrected about their steak by a waitress. Emily laughed softly and shook her head. You are never going to forget that. Daniel took a bite of the sandwich and leaned back slightly in the booth. Probably not. For a moment, they ate quietly, while the same peaceful rhythm from the night before returned to the room. The older man at the counter was there again, reading a newspaper beneath the warm lights while the quiet music from the radio played somewhere behind the kitchen wall. After a few minutes, Daniel placed the sandwich down and looked at Emily with a thoughtful expression. You know something interesting? Emily raised an eyebrow. What is that? Daniel rested his arms lightly on the table. Yesterday morning I believed I understood people very well. Emily stirred her soup slowly with the spoon. And tonight? Daniel smiled slightly. Tonight, I am not so sure. Emily looked at him calmly. That sounds like progress. Daniel laughed quietly. My investors might disagree. Emily tilted her head slightly. Investors like certainty. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Emily gestured around the diner with her spoon. But real life rarely gives certainty. Daniel studied her face for a moment before asking, Where did you learn to think like that? Emily shrugged gently. Watching people. Daniel waited for her to continue. Emily spoke calmly, her voice thoughtful. Working in restaurants, you see thousands of small moments. Someone celebrating good news. Someone having a difficult conversation. Someone sitting alone because they needed quiet. Daniel listened carefully. Emily continued. After a while you realize people are more complicated than they look from the outside. Daniel nodded slowly. That might be the most accurate description of the world I have heard in a long time. Emily smiled faintly. Books say the same thing. Daniel glanced toward the bookstore down the street, as if he could see it from there. You really like that place. Emily nodded. It reminds me that every person has a story. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Including billionaires running strange experiments. Emily laughed again. Especially them. They both smiled and returned to their food for a moment before Daniel spoke again. I have been thinking about something you said yesterday. Emily looked up. Which part? Daniel answered quietly. The part about time showing what people value. Emily nodded slowly. Yes. Daniel looked around the small diner again before speaking. I realized something today. Emily waited patiently. Daniel continued. Yesterday, I spent hours waiting outside a restaurant just to see if you would return for dinner. Emily raised an eyebrow slightly. You did. Daniel smiled. Which means I valued that conversation more than I expected. Emily leaned back comfortably in the booth. And tonight? Daniel met her eyes across the table. Tonight, I chose to spend my evening here instead of at a business dinner worth several $1,000,000. Emily blinked once in surprise. You canceled a meeting? Daniel nodded. Yes. Emily studied him carefully for a moment. Why? Daniel answered honestly. Because I wanted to see you again. The simple statement hung quietly between them for a moment. Emily looked down at the table before smiling gently. That seems like a very unusual business decision. Daniel laughed softly. It probably is. Emily glanced toward the diner window where the city lights shimmered softly against the glass. You know what the interesting part is? Daniel raised an eyebrow. What? Emily looked back at him with calm certainty. I almost said no yesterday. Daniel blinked in surprise. Really? Emily nodded. I thought the whole situation was strange. Daniel smiled. You were not wrong. Emily continued thoughtfully. But something about the way you waited outside the restaurant made me curious. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Curious about what? Emily answered simply. Whether the experiment was really about money. Daniel leaned back slowly as he understood what she meant. And what is your conclusion now? Emily smiled quietly. It was not. Daniel returned the smile, realizing that somewhere between a forgotten stack of bills and two simple dinners in a small diner, the strange experiment he had started was quietly transforming into something neither of them had planned. Outside the window, the city lights glowed softly, while the quiet music continued playing in the background. And for the first time, Daniel Whitmore understood that the most valuable discovery he had made all week was not about money, investment, or prediction, but about the unexpected way a single honest decision could change the direction of an entire story. The diner had grown quieter by the time Emily Parker and Daniel Whitmore finished their meal, the soft clink of dishes and the low hum of the radio, blending into the calm rhythm of the late evening. Outside the window, the city lights shimmered gently against the dark glass, reflecting the endless movement of traffic that never truly stopped. Emily rested her hands around the warm cup of coffee the waitress had placed in front of her, watching the steam rise slowly into the air. Daniel sat across from her, his posture relaxed in a way that was rare for someone whose life was usually scheduled down to the minute. For a few moments neither of them spoke, but the silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful, like the pause between chapters in a book when the reader knows the story has changed direction. Finally, Emily smiled softly and broke the quiet. "You know something?" Daniel looked up with a calm curiosity. "What is that?" Emily leaned back slightly in the booth and gestured around the diner. "2 days ago you were leaving money on a restaurant table to study strangers." Daniel nodded slowly. "That was the plan." Emily raised her eyebrow with a hint of playful amusement. "And now you are sitting in a diner eating grilled cheese sandwiches with the waitress who ruined the experiment." Daniel laughed quietly, the sound warm and genuine. "Ruined is not the word I would use." Emily tilted her head. "No." Daniel shook his head slowly. "Improved." Emily smiled at that answer and glanced down at her coffee again. "That is a generous interpretation." Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "It is an accurate one." Emily looked back at him. Daniel continued calmly. "I spent years building systems that predicted behavior. Markets. Investments. Risk." Emily nodded as she listened. Daniel gestured lightly toward the quiet diner around them. "But the most interesting thing I learned this week did not come from a spreadsheet." Emily smiled faintly. "It came from a waitress who returned $1,000. Daniel nodded once and asked the right questions. Emily looked out the window again, watching a pair of headlights glide slowly past the diner before disappearing down the street. "You know what the funny part is?" she said softly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What?" Emily turned back toward him. "If you had not forgotten that money, none of this would have happened." Daniel considered that carefully before answering. "Technically, I did not forget it." Emily laughed gently. "True." Daniel smiled. "But you could have kept it." Emily shrugged lightly. "That would have been the easier decision." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yet you chose the harder one." Emily looked at him for a moment before replying quietly. "Sometimes the harder choice leads to the better story." Daniel smiled at that sentence as if it explained everything. After a moment, he reached for the bill and paid again, leaving a simple tip just as he had promised earlier. When they stepped outside the diner, the night air felt cool and calm, the quiet street stretching beneath the glow of the streetlights. Daniel walked beside Emily toward the car, but did not open the door immediately this time. Instead, he turned slightly to face her beneath the soft light. "Emily," he said gently. She looked at him with calm curiosity. "Yes." Daniel hesitated for the briefest moment, something that rarely happened in the confident world he usually navigated. "I started this week running an experiment about money." Emily nodded slowly. Daniel continued, his voice thoughtful and sincere. "But somewhere along the way it turned into something else." Emily folded her arms lightly and waited for him to finish. Daniel smiled quietly. "Now I am curious about something much more important." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Daniel looked at her with the same honest curiosity that had guided their conversations since the beginning. "Whether this story continues tomorrow." Emily was quiet for a moment as the soft sound of distant traffic moved through the street behind them. Then she smiled in that same calm way that had surprised him the very first afternoon in the restaurant. "That depends," she said gently. Daniel waited. Emily took a small step closer beneath the streetlight. "Will you still order the steak correctly next time?" Daniel laughed softly, the tension disappearing instantly. "I think I finally learned that lesson." Emily nodded with quiet approval. "Good." For a moment, they simply stood there beneath the glow of the city lights. Two people who had started the week as complete strangers and now shared a story neither of them had planned. Finally, Emily opened the passenger door of the car and paused before sitting down. She looked back at Daniel with a small, thoughtful smile. "You know something interesting about experiments?" Daniel leaned lightly against the door and asked, "What?" Emily answered softly. "Sometimes the most valuable result is the one you never expected to find." Daniel smiled as he closed the door and walked around to the driver's seat, realizing that the waitress who had returned $1,000 had also given him something far more valuable. Not a lesson about money, not a lesson about business, but the beginning of a story that neither logic nor prediction could have planned. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that honesty and kindness can change lives in the most unexpected ways, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to Love After Everything channel for more touching stories like this one. Your support helps us keep sharing meaningful moments, inspiring characters, and powerful stories that remind us how small choices can create extraordinary connections.